Over the last 2 days, the Supreme Court has handed down a series of decisions that, if we took them all together, they're some of the most important decisions we've seen in years. Most of the people are looking at them as separate cases, but I don't think that's the right way to look at them. This is really sort of pointing in a direction. So, taken as a whole, what you can see is a Supreme Court that has been absolutely stacked with right-wing operatives, really reshaping the American government. They're not just deciding individual cases, they're really changing who has power in America. They're changing how the government functions, they're changing who has rights, who gets to hold power, and all of that's really worth zooming in on. So let me explain what I mean a bit. The first case that really jumps out over the last couple of days is Trump versus Slaughter. Trump versus Slaughter is a huge step towards taking the modern American state, which really developed after Roosevelt when he takes office in 33, and it turns it over to the president. That decision right there is outrageous on its own because since Washington, Congress recognized that there were things that needed to be done, but members of Congress didn't have the experience or the expertise or the time to do them themselves. And so they created agencies. They created body of experts. Congress would establish the agency, make sure the people were qualified, and then give them enough independence to actually do the work. That's been our system. That really takes off after Franklin Roosevelt was elected and takes office in 33. Congress begins creating those agencies, and they're really designed to help protect American people. One that immediately jumps out is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So the SEC basically guarantees that people don't cheat on Wall Street. Companies have to be honest about the information they're giving investors. They can't take one price to one person and another price to somebody else. The SEC watches all of that. Another example is the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm a huge fan of the EPA because it decides things like how much of a chemical is safe to be in our drinking water, how much of the chemical in the air is safe to breathe. Now, I don't have those expertise. I couldn't tell you. And that's why these agencies are created. That is what their field is. They know this stuff. We don't want politicians making those decisions. We want somebody who, has the background in this area to ensure Americans are safe. Independent experts really looking at the science and making recommendations based on facts and not politics. One of the things that's happened recently is that Russell Vought, who's running the Office of Management and Budget, he's trying to eliminate peer review for federal grants. That matters because right now when scientists or even medical researchers apply for grants, those grants are reviewed by experts in the field. The proposal is to replace those experts with political appointees. In other words, instead of scientists deciding which scientific research deserves funding, he wants political loyalists to decide that instead. They could simply say, we're not funding climate research or DEI, or we're not funding this or that because I don't like it politically. Now, take that same idea and apply it across the federal government. That's exactly what Trump versus Slaughter is opening the door to. When a president comes into office, there are roughly 4,000 political appointments. Those have always changed. Cabinet secretaries change, attorney generals change, departments of defense change. These are political jobs. Many require Senate confirmation. That's how we got Pam Bondi. That's how we got Pete Hegseth. That's how administrations have always worked. But independent agencies are a bit different. For almost 90 years, they were protected under a case called Humphrey's Executor. I've always thought Humphrey's Executor was a bit more complicated than I'm learning it was. But what happened was Franklin Roosevelt wanted to remove William Humphrey because Humphrey wasn't supportive of the New Deal. The Supreme Court said no. The president could not simply fire the heads of independent agencies because he disagreed with them politically. That protection has now largely disappeared. John Roberts had wanted to get rid of Humphrey's executor for decades. Even when he was a young lawyer, he argued that presidents should have much more direct control over these agencies. So yesterday, the court finally gave him that. Now presidents can replace independent leaders with loyalists. Think about the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is supposed to protect consumers. They're supposed to stop false advertising, go after junk fees, make sure companies don't rip people off. Now imagine putting political loyalists in charge of those decisions. That's what we're looking at right here. We're looking at the takeover of the apparatus that is most used in modern American history by a presidency that is ferociously pro-business. There goes our nonpartisan protections. There go our protections for workers, for farmers, and frankly, there go protections for entrepreneurs in general, because one of the things these agencies do is make sure giant corporations don't simply crush smaller competitors that are trying to enter the marketplace. So one of the things that is worth pointing out is that these agencies would also be responsible for overseeing people like Trump. There was a report that Trump had made, I think, roughly $1.4 billion in crypto ventures last year. Now, do you really think political loyalists are going to aggressively investigate those crypto businesses? I'm guessing not. And that's why this case matters so much. But that's not the only thing the Supreme Court did. So one of the other major decisions that came down was National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the Federal Election Commission. I'm sure before long this will all be abbreviated, but this matters. It matters because it's yet another step towards putting more and more corporate money and wealthy money into American elections. Once again, the court divided 6-3. What they said was that those limits on what political parties can spend in coordination with candidates violates the First Amendment. In other words, we're just shoveling more money into our elections. Now, here's what is interesting. So, opposition to that isn't partisan. Republicans don't like it, independents don't like it, Democrats don't like it. Something like 80% of Americans believe there is already too much money in politics and want to reduce the influence of wealthy donors. But this court keeps moving in exactly the opposite direction. We've been watching this since Citizens United in 2010. That case came right after we elected Barack Obama. The case itself centered around a documentary attacking Hillary Clinton, but what it really did was open up the floodgates for outside money to pour into American politics. And since then, the court has continued moving in that same direction. If you actually look at where the biggest campaign donors in America give their money, the overwhelming majority is in support of Republican candidates. I believe among the 10 largest billionaire political donors, 9 support Republicans. I think the one exception is George Soros. That's one of the reasons he's become sort of a boogeyman on the far right. Again, you'd want to double check those exact numbers, but that's the picture. So think about what we've got now. On one hand, the court has given presidents more control over independent agencies. On the other, they've made it easier for wealthy interests to pour money into elections. Those aren't separate developments. They're very much connected. One gives more power to the people running government. The other gives more power to people financing government. And we're still not done, because another 6-3 decision dealt with transgender girls participating in girls' sports. Now, this has become one of the most defining political issues for the modern Republican Party, But it's worth asking why, because for decades, the issue that mobilized the radical right was abortion. Really, the modern anti-abortion movement begins in 1972 before Roe versus Wade. And we'll go into that in another episode. But for today's discussion, let's start in 1972. Because for 50 years, abortion was the issue that really energized conservative voters. Then Dobbs overturned Roe, ironically, by accomplishing one of the movement's biggest goals by overturning Roe. The court also took away the issue that had unified so much of the conservative movement. So they needed another issue. And increasingly, they've turned towards transgender Americans. But notice something. The focus is almost always on transgender girls competing in girls' sports. I don't ever hear that same concern about transgender boys playing boys' sports, and that's something worth thinking about. Now, whether you follow these issues or not, it's really important to understand why this matters, because ultimately, this isn't about sports, this is about civil rights. It's about whether every American is entitled to equal protection under the law, whether we begin deciding that certain groups have fewer rights than everyone else. And, Lincoln really warned us about this repeatedly. Once you accept the principle that some Americans deserve fewer rights than others, you've already surrendered the larger argument. After that, it's only a matter of time until somebody asks, well, what about you? That's the danger. Once government begins deciding whose rights matter more than somebody else's, we're really heading in a dangerous direction. So if we step back for a minute, we've seen two very important things. In one case, the court increases presidential power over independent government agencies. In another, it expands the role of wealthy donors in elections. Now, the third narrows protections for one group of Americans. Individually, these might seem like separate stories, but they really paint a picture. They all move power in the same direction, towards those who already have it. And it moves power away from independent institutions that are designed to protect ordinary Americans. And that brings me to what may be the most revealing decision of all, the birthright seditions case. Because unlike the others, this isn't just about shifting power. This is about the Constitution itself. Now, let's talk about what's happening politically, because once you understand what the Supreme Court has been doing, what happened in the House suddenly makes a lot more sense. One of the biggest stories that just came out, and it focused on the Supreme Court decision and what happened with the SAVE Act. Now, we had the Speaker of the House, and honestly, any Speaker of the House, even the weak ones, know how people are going to vote before bringing something to the floor. They don't bring up bills unless they know they're going to pass, or unless they've found a way to make them pass. The real master of this, and nobody has done this better than Nancy Pelosi. She simply wouldn't have let something like this happen, and frankly, neither would most speakers, which is why what happened to Mike Johnson seemed like such an enormous embarrassment. He looks weaker and weaker, but the other piece of this is much more interesting. It demonstrates pretty clearly that even Republicans don't really want to pass the SAVE Act. And that's a remarkable thing to see. And we're seeing similar cracks everywhere else. Across Republican-dominated states, lawmakers are refusing to redistrict no matter how much pressure Trump puts on them. Now, there are a number of reasons they don't want to, but one of the biggest is that Trump cares profoundly about the midterm elections. He knows exactly what's on the other side of them. If Democrats win back the House, there will be investigations into his administration under everything. He knows that, and he desperately wants to avoid that. But Republican members of the Congress have their own interests. They're watching Trump drive the party toward a cliff. And for the first time, we're beginning to see some of them push back. Now, let's be clear. They're not suddenly becoming champions of voting rights. That's not what's happening. They're looking out for their own political futures. They know how angry people are. They know how unpopular Trump is, how unpopular his policies are. And they don't necessarily want to spend the next 10 years explaining why they tied themselves to these policies. That's why you're seeing hesitation. What does that mean for the housing bill? Honestly, it's still unclear. What does it mean for the National Defense Authorization Act? That too is unclear. But what it does tell us is that something's changed. A few years ago, the SAVE Act probably would have passed. It still could. I'm certainly not saying that it's dead, but the fact that Republicans themselves are hesitating really tells us something important. Pressure is really beginning to work. Really, they're starting to feel the American people and feel how unpopular these are. And that's something worth looking at. Looking at the panic, the pressure, the constant efforts to change the election rules. They're acting like people who know they're vulnerable. Mike Johnson has actually admitted this. And this is worth paying attention to. This is change. These are things we need to keep pressure on. These are things that we need to continue keeping in our awareness and really pushing for. I'm going to dive deeper on the next episode. Follow, like, and let's keep breaking down what is happening in America today, and I will see you next time.